Hi everyone, in this lecture we'll go over Layne's critique of the democratic peace theory. Quickly, because we've covered this probably when we covered our introduction to liberalism, the democratic peace theory is, we at least covered the foundations of this before, but the democratic peace theory is that democracies don't go to war with each other. So the rest of this lecture will be sort of an explanation of how the democratic peace works, and you should see some similarity, you should have some familiarity with some of the reasons that we're going to give for the reason why democracies don't go to war with each other. We're going to say democracies in this lecture, but we mean something like a republic in terms of Kant from before, or liberal democracies, as we also sort of talked about before. So, but we're going to say democracies for the most part of this lecture. But we're going to mean the same thing. So we're going to see, sort of, we're going to lay that out a little bit. We're going to remind ourselves about why democracies might not fight wars. But the most important part of this lecture really is going to be where Layne critiques the democratic peace theory. He's going to test it, and he's going to use some historical cases to sort of rebut it a little bit. So we're in the liberalism section. The democratic peace theory is very much a theory within the liberal approach to international relations. You already know that, I think. And so see Layne as a critique of this, but a serious critique, as somebody that's taking this democratic peace theory seriously, and who, however, finds it lacking, and so you'll see some of the reasoning behind why Layne doesn't ultimately find the democratic peace theory to hold. All right. All right, so the democratic peace theory, a critique by Layne. So first of all, why is it important? He thinks it's important for two reasons. The first thing is this: it gets at the heart of the debate between the second and third image approaches to IR. This is when we talked about this early on in the semester. We talked about the different approaches to IR and the different levels of analysis. We've got like the systemic level that Waltz sort of invents this idea of the different levels, or he at least crystallizes it in his writing, but he has the systemic level, which he thinks is the one that we should look at, because it's the most simple and the most straightforward, and we can take just a few factors and extrapolate all sorts of conclusions from those factors, systemic level factors. Then there's the unit level, which is like, let's look at the state, and that's what liberals are probably more apt to do, right? Because to realists, it doesn't matter if a state is democratic or autocratic, or that's not something that the realists would be looking at. But liberals are looking at that. They're talking about democracies and saying, look, democracies are fundamentally different from autocracies. They behave in a different way, right? For realists, a state is a state. So this democratic peace theory gets to the heart of that debate, right? Do we have to look at the regime type of the state? Do we have to look at the unit level? Or does that not really help us? Right? And of course, if the democratic peace theory is true, then we have to look at the unit level, because we have to look and say, is this a democracy or not? Because then it's going to behave differently from if it's an autocracy. But if the democratic peace theory doesn't hold, then we don't have to look at the unit level, perhaps. That's one less reason to look at the unit level. Secondly, it's become important to policymakers who think that the US should pursue democratization across the world in order to switch IR from the laws of realism to the laws of liberalism. If you were around and you were watching the news and television and following the media in the run-up to the Iraq war, you'll have seen a lot of this, right? I saw after the event, Tony Blair, the British Prime Minister, was on The Daily Show, was being interviewed by Jon Stewart on The Daily Show. And I watched that, and he, one of the big things, whenever you get Tony Blair on the television, one of the big things to ask him is about the Iraq war, because of course it was a controversial decision of his to take Britain in and against a lot of opposition from his own party. Some resignations took place right after he went in, but he really fully supported the United States, and he saw it as a moral obligation despite the opposition. And so this is oftentimes a topic of conversation if you see interviews with him, but and it was with Jon Stewart. And Jon Stewart asked him about it, and Tony Blair said something very close to it, stuck in my mind ever since because of the democratic peace theory. But he said something like, very close to, we know democracies don't go to war with each other. So what we were doing is we were making the Middle East safer, right? In let's say transitioning Iraq, right, from an autocracy to a democracy. We were leading to less war in the Middle East. We were fighting this war to make less war in the future, something like that, right? So that's based on this democratic peace theory, right? That's what he says. He says we know democracies don't go to war with each other, right? So he's making policy decisions based on that. All right. So that's why it's important. And so that's British policymakers, which they're not unimportant, but they're not US policymakers. But of course, US policymakers, they also read international relations theory too, and they think. Well, some of them write international relations theory as well. Anyway, so this is the two reasons why it's important to know, is the democratic peace theory, does it hold or does it not hold? And so there's two strands of the causal logic, right? In other words, if the democratic peace theory works, how does it work, right? And there's two things. One is that there's an absence of war between democracies because of institutional restraints, and there's two types of institutional restraints. One is public opinion, which of course Schumpeter and Kant, who we've already looked at, thought the same thing. They thought that the public opinion would be against war because the public have to pay the price of war, and they usually don't want to pay that price unless it's really serious. The second one was the domestic institutional structure. Right? There's something about the way democracies are set up that prevents them from going to war, like checks and balances. Things like, we'll see this on the next slide, but also things like, accountability, like accountability of the governments of the people, transparency, right? The government sort of have to show why they have to explain why they're doing things and how they came to those decisions, and they're scrutinized by a free media, and all those things that's the domestic institutional structure, right? It might be that war has to be declared by the legislature, or they have to get permission, right, to prosecute war by the legislature. And certainly for the Iraq war, Tony Blair went and made the case in Parliament and had to get the backing of Parliament to go to war, right? And so these things make it harder, right? If you're an autocrat, you likely don't have to get permission of Parliament. You can usually do whatever you want to do, and there's not much in the country, not many other bodies in the country that can really stop you. So, if Putin wants to invade Ukraine, is there any institutions in Russia that will stop him? Will public opinion stop him? And that's two things, right? Because the one thing is, like, would the public want to stop it, right? And that's something that Layne's going to deal with as well. So institutional restraints is one thing, and that includes public opinion and the institutional structure. The second one is democratic norms and culture, which we also talked about. We talked about this, I think, with Kant. We went into that whole thing about you and me creating this country, and like those sorts of norms that we establish between ourselves in order to sort of control one another and make sure that we can both live together, sort of relatively peacefully, maybe in competition, but with some sorts of rules that preclude us from killing each other and that sort of stealing each other's things. Well, those norms, like, they spread and help us to sort of come to peaceful resolutions with other countries as well. You and I came to a peaceful resolution, and so we can do that with other countries as well. That's the democratic norms and culture. We have a culture of democracy, a culture of working out our differences, sort of according to the rule of law, with set procedures and all that sort of thing. So here's the democratic peace theory in a nutshell. It's this: it's that, look, democracies are not necessarily more peaceful. They're not generally more peaceful than other states. Democracies go to war. We just talked about the Iraq war, for example, and the UK and the United States. They went to war. They go to war. But the democratic peace theory says, but they never or very rarely go to war against one another. So, which tends to support Kant's idea of like a federation of republics anyway. Democracies also rarely threaten to use force against another democracy as well. All right, so that's the democratic peace theory. So the first causal logic is institutions. Citizens pay the price of conflict and blood and treasure, right? Their own treasure. So there's debate about actions that may lead to war done in public. So we can see, look, there's parliaments talking about going to war. Let's get involved. Let's stop them, or let's stop them in the democratic peace theory. Governments don't want to lose elections, right? So everybody can see what they're doing, and there's going to be an election next year. Are they going to go to war or not, right? And they might not want to go to war if it's unpopular. So that's part of how public, voting institutions, right? The institutions of elections can prevent war. Checks and balances, executive selection. There's quite a lot of research on this that I find somewhat interesting, right? But it's this idea of like who gets chosen to be the leaders. And oftentimes the people that get chosen to be leaders, especially in Britain and America, because you've got these two big parties, any political system where you've got these two big parties, the parties themselves sort of act as a moderating force, because if you've got a really big party, one of the things you've got to do is like keep different factions of the party together. And so the people who end up being leaders of those parties are people who are good at resolving conflicts and being fairly moderate. Because if you're on one side of the party or the other, if you're on, let's say, the left of the party, then the right of the party is going to hate you, and they're not going to put you in a position of leadership in the party. And similarly, if you're on the right, then the left's not going to let you get into power. So the people that get to be the leaders of the parties, these big parties, are more moderate people who can bring both sides together, right? So then that's executive selection, right? You're selecting democracies choose executives who are moderate and sort of peacemakers. The second one is political competition, which means that in democracies there's political competition, which means there's more than one party basically. And so if the people don't like you, then they're going to vote in the other guys. And as long as that holds, right, then you're at risk of losing your grip on power. If you're not at risk on losing your grip on power, like where's the political competition, for example, to Putin? Is there a political competition there? And it's up to you, like you can go either way, right? But there is an opposition in Russia, right? But are they powerful enough to be a viable alternative to the United Russia Party, which it looks like they might not be, right? Because the United Russia Party and President Putin in particular has been in power for a long time. So, right. And then there's this pluralism in the foreign policy process. You're involving, it's not just one person or one small oligarchy, one small group of like-minded individuals. You're bringing in many democracies, bring in many different stakeholders. Certainly there's the government, but there's also non-governmental stakeholders like businesses, big businesses, professional associations, perhaps of lawyers, things like international lawyers, perhaps universities, all these other parts of civil society who have an interest in foreign policy, right? Can we get foreign students coming into our country, right? Is that going to disrupt the flow of funding for universities, right? In the argument is that in democracies you have that. In autocracies, you have one central figure perhaps, or a small cadre of a government that like just has full power and decides whatever it wants, and whatever it's in its own interest. It doesn't have to worry about what the universities say, or what maybe what parts of the military might say, or what parts of the foreign office says. It doesn't matter, right? Because they're all sort of subjugated to one head. So that's the pluralism thing. Causal logic 2 and norms, and we've talked about this a little bit. I think crystallized them into some nice boxes there. Democratic countries are governed by norms of peaceful resolution and conflict. They extend that into foreign policy. So those same norms. They expect other democracies to behave in the same way that they are, that they behave, and then they assume non-democracies are not governed by these norms, which is why they'll go to war with non-democracies. They worry they will be exploited by non-democracies and so adopt less peaceful norms when dealing with them. This is what Layne says. He says, look, if institutional constraints operated in the way liberals think they do in the democratic peace theory, then democracies would be more peaceful towards everyone. If you notice in the institutional constraints, those institutions are the same whether you're dealing with an autocracy or a democracy. If you're Britain, whether you're dealing with Iraq or the United States, your domestic institutions are the same institutions, right? So if those institutions stop you from going to war, they should be stopping you from going to war with Iraq as much as they'll stop you from going to war with the United States. But that's not what the democratic peace theory says. It says you only don't go to war with democracies, but you sometimes go to war with autocracies. So the fact that the democracies sometimes go to war and sometimes don't go to war, depending on who the other state is, that means that it's not institutional constraints for Layne. That can't be the cause. So he gets rid of them, so that you've only got the norms left now. So he says, well, let's test the norms then. So we're going to test these democracies and we're going to see if the norms stop them from going to war with other democracies. We're going to look at some cases. So they say, look, democratic peace theory says, right, public opinion should be pacific. People should want peace, not war. Policymakers should not threaten force against other democracies. If they do that, then the democratic peace theory is not true, Layne says. And they shouldn't prepare them to use force. They shouldn't threaten it. They shouldn't prepare to use it. If they do, if they threaten to use it against democracies or they prepare to use it against democracies, then we've debunked the democratic peace theory. That's what Layne says. And then he goes a little bit further and says, look, policymakers shouldn't even use ultimatums, hard lines, big stick diplomacy. They shouldn't threaten force. They shouldn't do anything like threatening force, if the democratic peace theory is true. And he says, look, on the other hand, realism suggests that there's no restraint in matter of national interest, but there will be ultimatums, there'll be hard lines. Even against other democracies, relative military capabilities should still be a factor. We should still care how powerful their military is, and they should care how powerful our military is when we're doing these negotiations. And if they do care, then that means that there's some expectation that the military might be used, which then gets rid of the democratic peace theory for Layne. States should consider the wider distribution of power. So, you'll see this in a second in one of the examples, but, let's say Britain and America get into some sort of conflict. Well, the relative military capability of the United States versus Britain should come into account, but also so should be, what about France? What's France doing? Is France on Britain's side? Is France also hostile to Britain? What's their military like, right? What about Germany, right? So that's what that means. Here are our four cases: 1861, 1895, 1898, and 1923. One critique of Layne, if you want to make it, is, look, these are all quite old examples. And then you can start to talk about, well, what was the level of democracy in these countries at this time, right? What Layne has to claim, right, is that no, these guys are democracies, right? And in some ways he has an easy job, in some ways he has a hard job, right? His job is easy because Kant is talking about, republics in 1775. When's he writing? 1778, something like that. Anyway, 1795. Anyway, long before 1861. Kant's already talking about republics and public opinion and democratic norms, right? So he thinks that they exist. Schumpeter, right? Schumpeter is talking about the United States in the war against Mexico. What's that? 1868 is that? So that's Layne's case. He's like, yeah, this is fine. We can talk about it, but I think some students that I would have might think, well, the United States democracy, or the British democracy for that matter, it looks a little bit different in 2021 than what it did in 1861, and that's not an invalid argument. But so you have to weigh those things up. But anyway, so we'll be looking at the United States versus America in the Trent Affair. We'll look at them again in the Venezuela crisis in 1895. We'll look at France and Great Britain in the Fashoda crisis in Egypt in 1898, and then we'll look at France and Germany, the Ruhr crisis, when France invades and occupies the Ruhr region in Germany in 1923. And so again, the argument is that these are all democracies going to war, right, or at least getting involved in a conflict. And so this is the first one, Anglo-American Crisis 1. So this is the background. A boarding party from the USS San Jacinto, I don't know how to say that, to be honest with you. I assume it's something similar to that. Boarded a British mail ship and arrested the Confederacy's James M. Mason and John Slidell, and took them to Boston. So yeah, the British are actually transporting these back, getting them out of, I think they're going to be ambassadors to Britain from the Confederacy, and this British ship has taken them over there. But the Americans intercept the British ship, they board it, they get these two taken prisoner back to Boston. And the British public goes mad, right? And remember, one of the things that this democratic peace theory, it depends on public opinion being more pacific. And so what Layne's saying is, no, the British public were not pacific when this happened. They were bellicose, right? They were going for war. And so now what does the government do? Well, London made military threats and sent an ultimatum: release the prisoners, or say that the USS Jacinto acted without orders and sort of issue an apology, and do that within 7 days. That's an ultimatum. And as they made that ultimatum, they bolstered their military presence in Canada, and they sent more naval ships to the United States of America, and they banned the export of ammunition to the United States. Layne's argument is, look, these are preparations for war. If it's a democratic peace theory, if that holds, democracies are not going to war with each other. They're not going to prepare for war against each other, but the British were. And they were making ultimatums, they were making threats. And it says, look, this sort of taking of these two prisoners made Britain look weak internationally, and Britain wanted to protect its image, save face, and so it needed either the US to back down quite significantly in releasing the prisoners, or issuing a very strong apology, or both, right? Look at this last one. The US believed the threats, saw wars too costly, and backed down. That's important as well, because we might say up to that last square, we might say, well, still they haven't gone to war. And that's true, right? If you say, well, do democracies go to war? And you say, well, what about the Anglo-American crisis with the San Jacinto? And then you say, well, they didn't go to war. And you're like, well, that's right, they didn't. And so then you say, well, then the democratic peace theory holds. And you say, well, and so Layne says, well, no, it didn't hold, because the US believed that there really would be a war if they didn't back down. If Layne's saying, okay, like maybe you think these troop movements, maybe you think it was all just a bluff and it wouldn't have ended in war anyway. There was no way it would. But if you think that, then you think something different from what the American policymakers thought at the time. The American policymakers at the time thought there might really be a war, and democracies might really go to war against each other. So they didn't believe in the democratic peace theory. They expected a war, and so the democratic peace theory falls down, says Layne. Here, just to sort of rebalance things between the British and the Americans, we'll show one where the Americans are victorious. This is a little bit later, where American power is a little bit more established. Britain and Venezuela, they have a border dispute, and Caracas hoped that Washington would intervene in. The US had the Monroe Doctrine, and remember, which was that, hey, European powers stay out of the Western Hemisphere. This is our space. And so they had this, and so they says, look, we will intervene diplomatically, right, to sort of, we'll lay down the law in this Western Hemisphere, and we'll tell you where the border is going to be. And so they sent this ultimatum to London, sort this border out, otherwise there'll be trouble. And Britain refuses, and so President Cleveland makes a speech to Congress saying, we're going to have to go to war over Venezuela. And Britain conceded. At that point, they worried that they might lose Canada in a war against the United States, and they also had a bad international environment. This is the example where, Layne said you have to look at the balance of power, the wider balance of power in the international system. Germany, France, and Russia were all threatening Britain, and so they couldn't spare the warships to go and fight a war with the United States over in the Western Hemisphere, and so they they backed down. But both sides, Layne says, had prepared for war. Americans and the American public supported a war with Britain. So again, the people were not pacific, and there was nearly a war, which was avoided because Britain believed that the United States really would go to war, and so they backed down. Another example, the Anglo-French struggle for control of the Nile. Britain had sent troops to Egypt in 1892, and they hadn't withdrawn them. This hurt French prestige and threatened their standing, and so they said, you know what the French are like with their standing, so they said, right, we're going to go and occupy the headwaters of the Nile, then we'll be able to control the flow of water, and that'll, you know, if the British can be in Egypt all they like, but we'll have the headwaters. So off they send this expeditionary force towards the headwaters of the Nile, and Britain, they got there first, basically, or they met the French on the way there and said, with a bigger force, a bigger military force, and said, no, you're not going any further, you're not going to go to the headwaters of the Nile, we're in charge here in Egypt, you go away. And the French government met with the British and said, look, you know, okay, we get it, you know, you've got more soldiers there than us, we don't really want to have a war, let us withdraw sort of honorably, give us an out. And the British says, no, we're not going to give you an out. You tried to embarrass us, and you're the ones who are going to end up embarrassed. You're not going to save any face. Off you go, you know, with your tail between your legs. So Britain refused to give France an out, taking a very hard line. We're going to kill these guys unless they retreat. Get out of here. You know, is that the way you expect two democracies to deal with each other under the democratic peace theory? And the answer is like, maybe no. Especially when the hard line is supported by a bellicose public opinion and the elite politicians. Britain prepared the Navy for a war with France. So they were getting ready to go to war. And France believed it because they gave up. And if they hadn't believed it, they wouldn't have given up. So again, all of these, they're examples where there wasn't a war. And this is the thing. So Layne has his work cut out for him here because he wants to show that, no, the democratic peace theory is not true. And the easiest way to do that would just be to say, well, look at these wars between democracies. But the problem is there isn't any of those. That's harder to find. And so what he's doing instead is he's saying, well, here's some cases where there wasn't a war, but there was the potential for war. And both sides believed that war was going to happen. And so that means that the democratic peace theory is not true. Last one then, this is after the First World War. You got the Treaty of Versailles. France isn't getting the money that the Germans agreed to pay them at the Treaty of Versailles, and so they invade and occupy the Ruhr industrial region in Germany, which produces a lot of the things that Germany produces. And Germany didn't put up active, you know, both democracies here. So you've got one democracy invading another democracy here, right? Germany did not put up active military resistance because it didn't have the capabilities at the time, but they did organize passive resistance and prepared a military response if France would have passed the Ruhr, the river there. So German democracy didn't reassure France. So there was nothing about them being democracies that prevented this crisis. And this is another case where Layne has to say it's true there wasn't a war, but he's saying, look, there only wasn't a war because Germany didn't have the capabilities to fight France at the time, and that there would have been a war if France had passed the Ruhr. So that's it. Take it as you will. It's a good discussion. Give the reading a try. I mean, you probably have the main points here in this lecture, but if you have any questions about it, definitely about the lecture, definitely look at the reading. It should answer any of those questions. But yeah, it's about the democratic peace theory, which is the biggest probably contribution of liberal international relations to the world. And this is Layne's attempt to sort of undermine it a little bit.